Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone who is just joining our webinar. Welcome everybody. I can see participants joining our Real-World Evidence for Decisions webinar today. We will be talking about co-creating real-world evidence excellence for decision making. And this is the first of our series of webinars where we'll be talking particularly with our regulatory colleagues, and we have a great panel of experts of HTAs and payers to discuss how we can collaborate better to really use real-world evidence to inform all of our decisions. I think we'll go to the next slide if we can. That's great. So as people are still logging on, I'll just give you an overview. Firstly, to introduce myself, I'm Karen Facey. I've got a part-time post at the University of Edinburgh, and today I'm consulting with INAMI RISIV, the National Insurance and Health and Disability Organization in Belgium. And we'll begin today with an overview from Yoda Koch, the CEO of INAMI RISIV, and our keynote presentation from Xavier Kurtz, who is Head of Data Analytics at the European Medicines Agency. After Xavier's keynote presentation, we will move to short interventions from our key panelists, Dr. Rushin Adams from the NCPE in Ireland, Antje Bering from the GBA in Germany, Claudia Furtado from Infamed in Portugal, Pier Paolo Olimpieri from IFA in Italy, and Pierre Ranenheimo from FIMIA in Finland. And during that time, we hope this will be a very interactive session. So please do type any questions you've got as you hear various speakers into the Q&A box, and you can like questions and they will put them up my list. So without any further ado, we'll have these presentations and interventions in about 30 minutes at least at the end of this 1.5 hour session for your interventions. I'm going to hand over immediately to Yoda Koch.
Hello, thanks a lot, Karen, and welcome to the audience in this webinar on real-world evidence for decisions, which is, of course, part of our project or initiative we have taken some years ago. And I think it's always good to have some contextual information about what we are doing and what we are trying to achieve. And our network or initiative is conceived as a pragmatic and agile learning network on real-world evidence focused on HTA and payers' needs. It's clear that huge challenges still exist in the field of real-world data and real-world evidence. We will not have a semantic discussion on this wording. There are great opportunities probably, but also great challenges. There are a lot of activities, and it's difficult to identify all these initiatives. And we agreed that it was necessary to set up a network which is based on some basic principles, which are you see in the middle of the slides. It's sharing experience with other partners, other stakeholders, both HT and payer associations, but also and organizations, but also, of course, patient organizations, industry, and other stakeholders involved. Question is to build trust and to understand each other, to talk the same language and to have the same meaning about this difficult subject. And of course, there is a necessity to pool resources, especially when we are talking about real-world data. We are confronted with the need of data analytics, data sharing, and especially for small groups, of course, it needs cooperation between different organizations. And the challenge is to improve, of course, evidence-informed decision-making on highly innovative technology, for which we know that not always the real evidence is available at market launch, and therefore we need complementary information, and it should be completed with other data. And the real question is real world data game changer on that or not? And if yes, which are the necessities to take account with? Who I've already mentioned is a multi-stakeholder approach. I think it's very important because every partner is as a piece of the puzzle we have to make in order to get the right decision. And we should do that, of course, because we are lacking still robust frameworks and methodologies, but we are also confronted with operational, technical, and methodological gaps. And therefore, we set up this initiative in order to find appropriate answers. It's distinctive because it's payer-led. We have taken this initiative 4 years ago in order to see, okay, what can be interesting, what's interesting in this real-world data, but also which are the challenges and how can we find the right answers, but especially how can we also translate it when needed in outcome-based managed agreements, for instance. It's a multi-stakeholder approach, and in a recent article coordinated by Karen Facey, we identified the actions for each stakeholder group. We stress the need for collaborative approaches, and we have called for a transparent real-world data and real-world evidence generation plan, which is, I think, an important issue. Thus, we are advocating for a learning by doing approach. And next slide, please. We have launched a call last year, at the end of last year, in which I think it's necessary to look also on a European level in which way we can set up this learning network within the European health data space, which is based, of course, on voluntary mechanisms, which should be underpinned, as already mentioned, by robust methodologies. And as our plan this year was a triple aim, it's exchange information on these key evolutions and key projects which are underway. And that's the purpose of this webinar this evening, in order to get what's and to understand what's the purpose of Darwin, which are the possibilities which are integrated in the guidelines on registries and the other issues Dr. Kurtz will mention in its keynote presentation. This, I think, it's an important issue, but also to evaluate what could be in for the different partners, for the different players in this project, how to translate it in practice. The second element is invest in knowledge building based on practical examples together with the different stakeholders, and to realize that we have to ask the right questions and prepare for that. And a third element is, of course, advocate for the creating of a learning network on a policy field, which is, of course, important to have in place when, of course, all these initiatives will be concretized, and also when we are confronted with the Health Technology Assessment Directive, which is underway, and I think it's important to be prepared on that. And therefore, I think it's needed to bring together different people, 100 this evening, and I think it's important to take note about the evolutions which are underway. We will do that on an interactive way. This evening we will have Dr. Kurtz with a keynote presentation, followed by a panel composed of representatives of 5 member states, in which they will give their concerns, but also their experiences in this field. Have a nice evening. I think it's important to have this webinar, and as you see on the slide, there are 2 more which are underway, which are prepared, one in the month of September and another in the month of October. Have a nice evening, and I hand over to Karen.
Thank you very much, Joe. So Joe, they're really giving his vision and his challenges really as a payer from a healthcare system who for the past 5 years has recognized the challenges of some of the new products coming to market. We've got to make difficult decisions about highly innovative technologies with a paucity of clinical evidence. So is there a role for real world evidence? We're still trying to answer that question and doing it in a multi-stakeholder way. And one of the important things we know is that our colleagues, the regulators, are doing a lot of work in the real world evidence space. And so it's our absolute pleasure today to have Dr. Xavier Kurtz with us, who is Head of Data Analytics at the European Medicines Agency. And Xavier, I think you are going to share your slides and give us the keynote presentation, and we'll then move to the panel discussion. If you have any questions, do put them in the chat and I'll pick them up in the discussion section. Welcome, Xavier.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm trying to share my slide actually, and
if you're on a PC, there should be a green share button with
yes, I have it. Just I open my slide, but do not find it on my screen on the screen that appears now.
Marine, will we be able to share slides if Xavier can't get his open?
Yes, I can try to do that.
You can do it?
We can do it from our end if that would be easier. It's always the technology that gives us challenges.
We have backups.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, just I can start then. Thank you very much. I can start. Okay, wizard. My slide is on the screen. So good afternoon, everyone. I've been asked to provide an update on a number of topics around the use of real-world evidence by regulators and for regulatory purposes. Next slide. So I will start with the HMA EMA Big Data Task Force recommendations. And these recommendations are around the use of better data and data providing real-world evidence, and the use of this data into decisions on medicines that create a healthier world. And just this slide is to show that this is coming really on time now, because we have the Commission digital strategy that is starting. There are a number of initiatives also in the regulatory science strategy from EMA and from the European network of regulators. So this comes really on time. Next slide. And there are 11 recommendations. I'm not going to present all of them. I will perhaps just give an overview of the 5 first ones, which are really concerning data, and especially on the Darwin EU. Next slide. So this is just to show that there is a plan, and there is a plan of activities, and just to say you can have access to it. This is public, and we are more or less on time and on track with the different milestones. So we're at this stage we have a plan until 2022. Next slide. So how will the future look based on the Big Data Task Force recommendations? We will have a network, Darwin EU, which is for data analysis and real-world evidence interrogation network, which will be part of the EU Health Data Space. And this Darwin EU network, which I'm going to present, will support better decision-making throughout the product life cycles via its network of expertise, partnership, and database. We will have an established source of evidence, like real-world evidence, to complement the clinical trials. we will have a system to have better discoverability of the data and with a known quality and better representativeness, allowing then all researchers, but also all the authorities to choose the optimal data source for a given need for a given study. We will have a system for training and for sharing knowledge and experience around, among the EU network with learning initiatives and training programs that will allow the authorities and regulatory authorities to have better knowledge of the regulatory need, but also of the methodologies. We will have a suite of EU and international guidelines with to help to improve the processes, but also to foster transparency of the activities around the real-world evidence. And this will include an improvement and strengthening of the EU PASS register, and full compliance with data protection ethics and collaboration with all stakeholders. So this is a very ambitious program, but as I said, we are more or less on track to achieve this. Next slide. First of all, the Darwin EU. I think the purpose, the origin of this activity is that currently we have an access to many healthcare database that is rather limited. This may be accessible for local person, but this is not widely accessible. And when it is accessible, it may be complex and allowing only a slow analysis. So the objective is to establish a network of data, expertise, and services to support better decision making by EMA and national competent authorities. Next slide. So the purpose, the principle here that we will have a coordination center, and we are going to tender next month the coordination center. We will publish the specifications. The coordination center will be at the center of the data partners, but also at the center of the committees, the regulatory authorities and national competent authorities that have questions, and also will liaise with the data permit authorities that will be established by the EU health data space. So, and the concept here is that this should be a distributed data access where the data stays local with exchange of anonymous data, and will be based on a common data model with a common protocol allowing to make rapid analysis of the data. Next slide. We plan by 2023 to have a first coalition of existing data sets, and this network will be then included and will be integrated into the EU health data space. Next slide. The main principle for the working of this network is that when there are questions from EMA or national competent authorities, they will be evaluated as to the feasibility for access for being answered by real-world data. And then there will be the role of the coordination center to create protocols, to access the database, to create programming scripts. This will be sent to data partners that will provide an aggregated data to the coordination center that will compile and integrate and analyze the data from the different data partners and then provide them to the requesters. Now, we also foresee that in the future, the requesters will not only be EMA national competent authorities, but can be other stakeholders like health technology assessment bodies and payers and others perhaps. Next slide. The status, so we have started last year actually the identification of the requirements, and we have established the model, and this year is really the year that will see the initiation of the project, and as I said, with the tendering the identification and selection of the coordination center. Next slide. A second aspect that is important is data quality. Currently, we have relatively limited information on the quality of data source and their representativeness. So the objective here will be to establish an EU framework for data quality and representativeness. This will start this year already. We are also nearly in the process of publishing a call for an organization able to define the data quality frameworks and implement them in databases. Next slide. Data discoverability, as I mentioned, this is an important aspect, and this is ongoing. We have a project which is already ongoing in order to develop the set of metadata that will describe and characterize data source. This set of metadata will be piloted in 10 databases in Europe, and then based on this pilot phase, there will be recommendations and then extension of this project to a large number of databases across Europe. Next slide. Network skills, so there will be a curriculum that will be developed and that will be applied to and provided and offered to the EU regulatory network. And this will include areas like statistics, epidemiology, data science. So in order to allow all stakeholders actually using the data to assess them and write protocols and define what are the requirements in terms of methodological standards. Next slide. Regulatory process, and I would like just to show that you may know that the EU passed register, and there is a project that will start this year and end of this year to enhance or replace the EU pass register with a much ambitious project that will provide more information and will increase the transparency of studies. Next slide. Then. So I would like just to, around real-world data, real-world evidence, show 2 or 3 slides on a study that we have done, we have started last year, and we are doing the analysis now. And this is really important to show what is the place of real-world data, real-world evidence in marketing authorization application and extension of indications. We have done the study in for all submissions for new product or existing product, but in 2018, 2019. And and this was a rather important work and time-consuming work, because actually we have no repository of the real-world data that are included in submissions for new applications. So this led to a manual review of reports, risk management plan, and so on. This and then we had to also implement validation of the data extraction by independent reviewers. Next slide. Would like just to say that as we are speaking about real-world evidence, we know there is a standard definition of real-world evidence that everybody knows, but now in order to have a working definition, it is a very different thing, because what is included as real-world data, real-world evidence, and what is not included was an important problem that we had. And I'm not going to read everything here, but for example, do we include the patients who have been who were included in clinical trials and where our follow-up afterwards in an open label study? Do we include them? We said no, because they were initially included in clinical trials. Also, in terms of publication, what do we use or not? So there is, this is not, and I don't think there is, we have saw there is no agreement or international agreement or standards about what practically it means to be, as real-world data, real-world evidence, beside the general definition that this is not clinical trials. Next slide. And we are doing the results now, but just I would like just to show that for new marketing authorization applications among all the product that had real-world evidence. There was a large number of products for which the application contained data from disease registries. And this was a bit of a surprise for us because this is a very important improvement according to a previous study we did several years ago. And disease registries and then also different types of electronic health records. In a study that we have done 5 years ago, product registries were very frequently used, but this is much less now. So this importance of disease registries is important for the guideline on registry-based studies that we are developing now. Next slide. So I will perhaps skip this one because otherwise I will not have the time. So the guideline on registry-based studies, the objective is to provide recommendations on key methodological aspects of registry-based studies and on the relevant legal basis and regulatory requirements. So our mandate as EMA is to provide requirements and guidance to marketing authorization application or orders, but we think that this guideline could be also very useful to patients and to persons involved in the funding, creation, and management of registries. So that's why the next slide. The content of the guideline, the draft guideline, we divided it in two. Actually, the main guideline is on registry-based studies that are being done by companies, because this is what our mandate, our competence, our area of activity. But next slide, we provided an annex which that provide consideration on registries, and this is what we think is important in terms of quality of registries to provide valid information for studies. And then we received this guideline was published for consultation last year. We received many comments from 62 organizations, and we estimated we counted it, it's 960 comments that we received on the guideline. So it raised a large, many interest. And so we have what we are revising now, the definitions based on the comments, and these are definitions that we are revising on patient registry and registry-based study. What we think it is important is to highlight the difference between a patient registry and a registry-based study, and this is highlighted in the guideline. A question that we often received is to provide recommendation on when a registry-based study is acceptable for a specific regulatory purpose, like an application. And we are resisting this this request because we still think at this stage we do not have enough experience on knowing when disease registries are useful or not for a given purpose, and this is mostly assessed on a case-by-case basis. Next slide. Just I would like to highlight the feasibility analysis, and this probably is important because this is something that we introduce, and we asked we will have the companies to do it with the registry holders, and to discuss it with the regulators at a very early stage of the applications in order to assess whether these registries are a registry is suitable for a given study. And there is the content here, and we were it was good that this was very well received by most of the organization that commented on the draft guideline. And also we see that it is already used. Actually, it is already used, even if this is not officially published. It was so this seems to be an important and interesting contribution from the guideline. Next slide. So as a conclusion, I have a number of questions, and this may be a starting point for the discussion, perhaps. So first of all, how what could be the interactions between HTAs, bodies and payers, and the big data steering group, and the implementation of the big data recommendations to promote collaboration and implementation of the recommendations. Where do you see the role of HTA and payers in the Darwin EU network? For example, do you see that HTAs and payers could provide questions, for example, and then that could be then fed into the Darwin network for providing answers and for doing data analysis around Europe? Where could the research question be integrated, and where could a feasibility analysis be performed? What would be the role of pharmaceutical companies, actually? Then regarding the guideline, primarily it has been developed to promote better use of disease registries for regulatory purpose. Do you think that it is applicable? How could it be useful for HTAs and payers? And then, well, I don't know if you have any major comments on draft guideline, but we are revising it now. So this is a good timing for providing any remaining comments. Thank you.
Xavier, thank you so much for that whistle-stop tour of all the great work that EMA is doing there. Certainly, you are addressing all the issues that I hear all the HTA and payer bodies talking about. So the issues about data coordination, data quality, how do we evaluate registries? Many of us come from countries, I come from Scotland, where we've got great data and we've had registries for a long time, but are they fit for purpose for decision makers is another question. So we're going to explore all of these issues now, and we're going to take some interventions from our panelists, and we're going to start with Dr. Pier Paolo Olimpieri from IFA, because within the HTA and payer world, we all know that IFA has used registries for many years. So Pier Paolo, we're really interested to hear your reflections.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fesi, and thank you for the opportunity to attend to this very important and interesting discussion. In Italy, we have a long history of collecting real-world evidence from product registries. We have a system that is going on since 2005, and it consists of a national web platform connected to an administrative database, and this platform hosts up to now more or less 200 different product registries. And we define a registry as a product registry as a registry that is monitoring a specific drug indication pair. So a registry for us is one drug and one indication. We use the data collected from this registry, which, by the way, are collected at a patient level. So we collect data on, we try to monitor the entire treatment for a patient. We collect data on patient's characteristics, prescription, dispensation, and of course the outcome. And the data collected are used to develop studies that can provide, are read and are commented by our internal commission, the Scientific Technical Commission of IFA and the Price and Reimbursement Commission, and help them to make decisions on drug utilization, placing therapy, effectiveness in non-experimental setup in the real world. A lot of these studies has been really useful for our commission. We have some hurdles, of course, during our history. We learn on our skin, for example, that a poor planning before collecting data is something that will lead to a poor results. So in this optics is the work that has been made for establish these guidelines for registry-based studies is really important, even if our product registries, which applied in a post-marketing phase, more in a post-marketing phase and for price and reimbursement mainly, and our product registries, so therefore are fall outside the purposes, the original purposes of the guideline. This guidelines is has been quite useful for us to understand where we can do better for developing better registries, for getting better studies and better evidences that can be used by our commissions. I'm thinking, for example, to the data quality part, which has been critical for us. Establishing guidelines allow us to create better procedures that can be used to make more reliable evidences that can be used to help in making decisions. Also, these guidelines can be useful not only just to improve the quality of the registries that we have, but also to understand how to use these registries better. For example, we have some hurdles in understanding for some registries, understanding how to compare the evidence we found, for example, an effectiveness for a specific drug in a specific indication, to compare with the available evidences. Therefore, having a guideline that states that help us understand how to perform, to create a study using also patient registries that can be used, for example, as comparison to compare with our with the data coming from our product registries can be really helpful to provide studies, to provide evidences that can be more helpful for our commission.
Thank you. That's a really helpful reflection. So even though you've had established registries for over 15 years, you're still seeing the value there of the EMA registry guideline in terms of helping you think about how you can improve the quality and that importance of planning. So planning data collection to make sure that it provides good data to optimize care. So really important. And I think we'll come back to that because I think the other speakers will have thoughts to share. So thank you very much, Pier Paolo. We'll come back to you. So I'm going to move on now to Claudio Furtado, who's head of the HTA Pricing and Reimbursement Division at Infomed. And Claudio, you're going to give us some of your experience about registries.
Yes, hello, Karen. In Portugal and in Infomed, we have currently two main approaches to use the real-world evidence as a tool to support our reimbursement decisions. The first one is based on a collaboration with the National Oncology Register. That is a nationwide base, and we identify, based on our HTA evaluation and negotiation process, we identify the medicines that are going to be subject to this monitoring. At the moment, we have 3 drugs that are being monitored for reassessment purposes: the pembrolizumab, nivolumab, and the palbociclib. But we also have CAR T cells that are being monitored for our outcomes-based management try agreement, in which the payment is only not completely, but part of the payment is based on the overall survival of the patient. So it is used both for this financing purpose and also for monitoring the effectiveness of the drugs. This is one approach, using the collaboration with this national register. But we also developed our own registries, and we have developed registries for hepatitis C in 2015 and for spinal muscular atrophy. These registries were developed with more than one aim. They were developed to monitor effectiveness and gain knowledge about treatment patterns and which is the standard of care for some subpopulations. But we also developed these registries, especially these two ones, with financing purpose also, because we only finance the hospitals and their patients if they are registered in these platforms. So it's a way of guaranteeing the comprehensiveness of these registers. So that is very useful also for us. This is the main two approaches that we have to use real-world evidence. But we are trying to develop another strategies, that is to take advantage of the health electronic records that are in place in Portugal, and we have a system that is based on a unique identifier, and we have a national health service. So it will be very useful to take advantage of this the system, and to develop the registers integrated in these electronic health records that will avoid the duplication of registering information, and also take advantage of this digital transition that we are all observing in Europe and in Portugal also. So, and for this, I think the guidelines that are being developed will certainly be an added value to this development, in order to guarantee that we have a common data set that will allow, if possible, joint analysis. Another element that I would like to mention is that it is must needed to improve collaboration, as we are doing today, between entities, not only HTA regulators, but between countries, in order to identify at an early phase which medicines are going to be subject to this monitoring. Because, and I stress this point because I think it's very important, because we have to have time to develop and to develop it in a structural way this collection of data. So we can have this common data set that will allow, if needed, joint analysis. And of course, we are going to need this joint analysis with the kind of medicines that are being introduced in the market now. And to conclude, I would just like to mention that I think the implementation of the HTA regulation could be an important, and I think it will be an important step to improve this collaboration at an early phase between, not only with EMA, but also with those other stakeholders, but between countries. I think we are going to gain much of this collaboration that we are going to have in each HTA process.
Claudia, thank you very much for that clear explanation of different types of ways in which you're using real-world evidence. The fact that you can use your national health data sets because you've got a unique identifier, the importance of the work that Darwin is doing there in terms of the common data model, all that work on data quality, and the need for us to all work together across member states. And that's, I think, something we'll definitely come back to in discussion. And I know that some of the smaller countries are particularly interested in collaboration and reflecting on what they're doing. And so at this point, it's good to turn to Roisin in Ireland and to hear your reflections about what's happening in Ireland and any potential you see for collaboration, Roisin.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks to you for inviting me to join this important discussion. I was very interested to hear Javier's presentation, particularly in relation to Darwin, and I suppose the immense opportunities that will bring. We know that there are challenges. Registries do seem to give a good description of natural history of diseases, and indeed can provide useful control groups against which to compare emerging treatments. But they are by design a historical cohort. And I suppose one challenge that we have as HTA bodies is they do not take account, I suppose, of the temporal changes in the standards of care, which is a real challenge for us when we're gathering data over time. Often I think about registries, an important missing piece is those who are not in the registry for whatever reason, because they also tell us important information about how diseases are managed in practice. And I suppose one comment that I was interested to hear recently is we have to be alert to the possibility of treatment-based disease making, which is an interesting concept. That being said, in Ireland, we have three main registries, formal registries, I would say, in the areas of cystic fibrosis, cancer, and both of these are underpinned by legislation, so excellent registries with very good coverage. But we also have a hepatitis C registry, and I shouldn't say but, because this is the one that I have most, I suppose, experience with. And what I would say is all these three registries have been in place for quite some time. But in terms of a payer perspective, the CF registry, while it is a disease registry, we were able to realize some of the benefits from that registry through analysis of that in terms of some of the newer CF expensive treatments that have been launched over recent years. And obviously CF is a disease that particularly affects patients in Ireland. So that was a very useful, I suppose, reuse of information from that registry. Our National Cancer Registry, like many countries, is an epidemiological registry and captures overall survival and indeed progression-free survival when there is additional staging. And while this is an incredibly rich source of information, it's not a treatment registry, and therefore we can't fully harness that to populate it for some of the new treatments, for example, the CAR-Ts. The Hepatitis C Registry was interesting. This was born, I suppose, out of the introduction of what we now know to be the curative hepatitis C drugs. And these, when these were launched, the lack of data around some genotypes was problematic for us as HTA assessors. So that was launched, and it now does provide that information and support actually some of the payment models that we implemented. Interestingly, this started out as a treatment registry, but has now evolved into a disease registry, which will be interesting over the next while because, of course, the WHO initiative to get rid of hepatitis C by 2030 begs the question, how long do we maintain this registry? In more recent times, I would say in Ireland, we've moved away from registry style data collection, certainly for drugs, and focus more on managed entry type agreements and outcomes collection to support these. So very targeted data collection. What we've realized is the governance, the outlay, the infrastructure required to establish registries is very significant. So our focus now is more to link data collection and outcomes, or indeed eligibility criteria through pre-authorization, to the reimbursement systems we have in place. And we do have those in place for a number of areas. So some of the rare diseases, some of the ERTs, the enzyme replacement therapies, and then for some of the broader chronic diseases such as heart failure, pain medications, where we've, I suppose, implemented some rules around that and can gather data from reimbursement databases, actually. So when a patient goes to a pharmacy, we gather a huge amount of information whether they are actually taking certain medicines. And that's actually been very useful to us also in terms of payers. When we start to look at treatments, often we find that the sequential nature of treatments is not captured in trials, so we actually have no evidence of where that person is now because, of course, the comparator has changed, or indeed the disease space has changed with introduction of new medicines. We have hit some challenges in Ireland because our GDPR legislation, the implementation is actually quite strict. So that has been quite problematic to us. But we're working through it. My hope, I suppose, is that we are careful not to overpromise on registry data. Real world data is not as robust as a well-designed RCT. And while we hear the challenges in relation to the technology, such as ATMPs, I think payers and indeed HTA bodies consider the balance between the benefit and price. That's what we do. And if the price of uncertainty falls solely on payers, then a model won't work. And finally, one last provocative comment. In the scenario where a particular technology does not produce the anticipated benefit, or the results are confounded, of course, by other treatments, where does that leave payers? So sorry to leave it on a provocative note, but I'm very looking forward to the discussion, and also on the considerations of how do we align the outcomes that we all gather. Thank you.
You're very welcome to be provocative, Roisin, and you raised a number of really important issues there. That point about using disease registries versus treatment registries, that's often what we're all calling for. But what we hear in practice is that actually getting the information that payers need to make those decisions about value for money or outcome-based agreements is quite challenging sometimes. And I think we need further discussion about how we can do that better. And your questions there about how long should we run a registry, how we can link in with the existing health system and reimbursement data we already have and align that across countries. So I think all of those things are going to be things we'll pick up in our discussion. And I'm going to move now to Pia Rananheimo, who is from Finland and another small country, but with lots of great data that could be used. Pia, tell us your thoughts.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in this discussion. So I work at the Finnish Medicines Agency in our HTA team, but I want to start by pointing out that FIMA is the national competent authority for regulating medicines in Finland. So our biggest department actually works with marketing authorizations and regulation, and saying that it's always been sort of really natural to do HTA regulatory collaboration at FIMEA, and EMA guidelines obviously have always been part of our HTA team's toolbox also. So in the context of HTA, I think we see nowadays that a big part of the national real-world data studies are based on electronic healthcare record or other hospital data instead of sort of traditional patient registry data. According to one estimate from a recent review, around half of the real-world data studies sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry and conducted using local data from Finland were primarily based on electronic healthcare records last year. So I think sort of the level of detail and depth that's needed from data nowadays is quite demanding. And we see in Finland that many of the traditional registers like the Finnish Cancer Registry, for example, does not collect data on sufficient detail. And that, for example, creates the need to combine data from different data controllers and other data sources than traditional registers. And we have the sort of identification code that makes it easy, and we are able to link all sorts of data sources together. So that's one of the benefits that we in the Nordic countries have. So in Finland, we have a relatively new national service provider for the secondary use of health and social care data called FinData, and FinData, among other things, issues permits and delivers data to those that need data resources from more than one data provider. And FinData also offers a safe remote access environment for analyzing data. So when I see presentations covering European health data space or Darwin, I see that these types of data permit authorities like FinData play an important role in that concept. But from our HTA work perspective, the thing really is that our HTA team only does very simple descriptive analysis using either wholesale data or reimbursement data. And we don't really need FinData to access that data. So at this point, we haven't really used FinData services for our HTA purposes. But of course, companies may submit real-world evidence to us where FinData has played a part in the process. But as I said, at this point, we don't do analysis requiring FinData services. But if we would use FinData services in the HTA context, they could provide us advice on how to fill in the data request and data permit applications, and then they would process our application and combine the data sets together. And we might even run the analysis in the environment. But I think it's important to say that many questions still remain, and those are mainly related to our own HTA payer processes. Things like who defines the real-world evidence needs, who writes the applications, who does the analysis and reporting, who pays, and so on. I think before I end, I would like to link this to the methodological guidelines. So I would say that we would also need a guideline for using electronic health record data in regulatory and HTA payer decision making. And if we look at this EMA guideline on registry-based studies, I think many of the same methodological guidance applies to our sort of evidence needs, and we are also faced with the same analytical issues related to non-randomized efficacy studies. And in my opinion, the differences in real-world evidence needs are largely linked to economic evaluation and its time horizon. And I think it's very important to stress this, because the economic evaluation point of view has been largely ignored in the EUNETA context that has focused on clinical effectiveness assessment. That's where I would like to stop now for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. From a very sophisticated data country in the Nordics there, reflecting on how EMA is developing a good guideline for registries, but perhaps that needs to be modified for the HTA system. We could take it and build on it. But actually what we maybe need to think about is a guideline for use of electronic health records. And we may come back and ask Xavier that question, because he talked about methodological standards. And as the data, they bring in the data into the coordinated data center, there are no doubt guidelines being developed. So I can see future work and collaboration definitely possible there. But before we get into that discussion, there's so much to talk about. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Antje Behring, Head of Pharmaceuticals at the GBA, to give us her reflection from a German perspective.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm just wondering, do you hear me? Thank you. Good. So with very great interest, I heard the previous talks, and I'm almost jealous, of course, always on the Nordic countries can easily collect these data without a huge bureaucratic burden, which is in Germany obvious that we have difficulties to collect data in many different ways. And of course, Germany is also a newcomer in this field. So we were, especially the GBA was very, very reluctant to use real world data in the benefit assessment. So one of the tasks of the GBA in pharmaceuticals is to determine the additional benefit from determine the additional benefit from one pharmaceuticals versus another pharmaceutical. And in addition to that, it's not a yes or no decision. We have to graduate this decision to major benefit or only minor benefit and so on. So up to now, the use of real world data was very, very little, and we don't have much experience, neither for the initial assessment nor for the reassessment. But it was due to, of course, low quality of data. And the other one was also that we had the feeling that the data presented were very naive. So the methods used from pharmaceutical companies to present the data, to use this data, were very naive. We had the feeling that even they had no randomized controlled trial in mind. So, I mean, the concept of emulation of target trials, I think it's very used to a lot of stakeholders, just to think about what would I have done if a RCT would have been possible, what would be the comparative group, what would be the outcomes, and how we can address confounders and so on. So if you have looked at these data were not quite well analyzed. However, I will just talk a little bit that we were forced, I would say, by the government to use more routine data. So there were a law which came into force in 2019, where the GBA was mandated to demand from pharmaceutical companies a routine data collection. And this is actually limited only to drugs where the evidence is anyway very limited, orphan drugs, conditional approval, or exceptional approval. And for these drugs, the GBA may demand a routine data collection. And in addition to that, it's completely new in the history of the German healthcare. We can restrict the reimbursement only to those participants who really participate in the data collection. And this is something very new that should stimulate and motivate also doctors and patients to contribute to these data collection. And for the very first time, also GBA is also asked to define the research question, to help planning the data, to help to define what kind of outcomes. And it's not that we can ask for every outcome which is there, it's also to just look for feasibility. So to give a more prospective way to think about data collection and so on. But however, it is still the responsibility of the company to collect these data and to find a way to use these kind of data. Yes, so that means that as an HTA body, we would like to have more impact on the data collection to make a prospective way, and not only to use the data which we just get and which is available, to make it more prominent. And I think if we are transparent about the outcome and also use this data for our decision, then I think there is an benefit for patients and also for doctors. It's not getting lost somewhere. And when I hear the experience of Italy, which have tons of data, but somehow there is not really a good use, then it would be too pity, because data collection and real world data is also not really done for cheap, I would say. It's really expensive because data need context and care, and also there's a lot of caveats. And with what kind of uncertainty we can live for our decision making, I think this we have to develop also as an HTA body. I would like to stop here, and I would like to have more time for the discussion and more interesting exchange of information.
And to thank you so much for that. Everybody's been very interested to hear what's happening with GBA. As we know, this is quite a change in the requirement of real world data. So I think you're right. Let's get to that discussion. And we've got a couple of questions in already. One in from Laurie Lambert, who I know is the new head of real world evidence at CADETH in Canada. And she's asking our panelists if they can describe a success story and a failure in terms of using real-world evidence in decision-making. And I wonder if I could start with Pier Paolo for that, because I think you've got, 15 years of experience with the IFA registries. So how about one story each side while the others are thinking a success story and a failure?
This is a very interesting question. We have a long history, 15 years. So there have been a lot of failures and a lot of success. I cannot pick one failure or one success. I can say that as long as we go on with collecting data and learning how to use them, we are now avoiding the pits and faults that we start making when we first start collecting this data, which are mainly related to bias selection and information bias. So data quality is a huge problem in our experience. So when there is no clear idea, there is no clear protocol, or there is no thinking through during the development phase, or there is no an immediate update when something huge change in the clinical practice, and you have to change the registries as well to follow the clinical practice and the new evidence obtained. Then you go to discuss in the committee. You go to use these studies, these evidences, and they're poor quality, and you fail to make a point, and these data are not reliable to. When there's a clear idea immediately, and you share with all the stakeholders, with clinicians, with structures, with health directors, what you need to do with this collection of data, what is the aim, and this has been done very recently, for example, for the CAR-T registries. that we have, in which there have been a lot of communication between all the users of the registries, the clinicians that have to fill in the data, and the local authorities that are responsible for data quality and data checking. And when you have shared with all these people that which is the aim and when are you going to collect and analyze the data, and what outcomes are you interested in? Then we have a very helpful discussion, and we see that it will make a difference in the decision, and also in understanding how to use the drug in the clinical practice.
Thanks, Pier Paolo. I think that's a great example there. So firstly, saying we need to be clear about the research question, and giving CAR-T there as a recent example in terms of collaboration, being clear about the research question. You can work with stakeholders to ensure that you're collecting data of high quality. I wonder if anybody else has got any examples of either good practice of real world data that has informed decision makings, or where it hasn't quite worked. Claudia?
Yes, maybe not a best success story, but I think the positive points that we had, I think that were for us a success, was the linkage to the financing. So it guaranteed that all patients were registered. That I think was a positive point in our short history, and also using the infrastructure and the analytical capacity that was already in place at the National Oncology Register, because that is one difficulty that we have at InfarMed, is to have the resources to analyze this data and transform it in evidence. So using taking advantage of the existing knowledge in other entities, I think it's an important point that I would like to advise, because it doesn't matter if you have data and you are not able to analyze it. One negative point is that these registers that are developed by InfarMed, they took a lot of time, and so they sometimes can lose importance if they are in place after many patients are already in treatment. That's why I think it is important to have a collaboration at an early phase, so we can have those registries in place in an attempted. Thank you.
Thank you. And similarities there between Claudia and Pier Paolo about linking the reimbursement or the ability to prescribe based on the data collection. So in a sense, the data collection is a requirement of the medicine, and that sounded, Antje, that sounded like what's being required in Germany. Is that correct with the new processes?
Absolutely. I can also not only echo, but what you just said, Claudia. Yeah, it's right. But I would like to add a good example. You know, we had once in an orphan drug. It was a brain disease, and I think it was a special, I think it was an Italian register who helped the pharmaceutical company to make an historical control arm, because it's such a rare disease, which were almost every patient was collected in this registry, so that we could almost say that everyone would be in. So what Rojin said, so we are thinking about who is not in the registry. We could almost exclude, because almost every patient was in this registry. And the single arm trial, what was done with the drug, the effect was such dramatic that therefore we could use these as a comparative arm for a historical control, and we could decide on a very good databases and without any uncertainty. So I can only have a good example on that drug. So it's effect size which actually convince people, convince HTA bodies.
That's a great example, and it actually answers Tom Lawrence's question, who was asking about the potential for use of real-world evidence as single-arm trials. And I wonder if any of the other panelists have anything they want to add to that. Roisin, you've probably dealt with this in kind of economic models where you've seen single-arm trials with external comparators. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose on the face of it, it seems like a good idea. I suppose a challenge we've had is, given that a lot of the registry data is historical, and a little bit what I was talking about, the treatments do change over time. So the comparability does suffer depending on the dates around that historical data. It sometimes can be used, and indeed, more importantly, has to be used, which is a challenge, but it's not as good. And I think we have to accept that, well, we don't have to accept it, but essentially, we have to accept that it's not really addressing the question in the most robust way, but it is something that we can attempt to do in the absence of an RCT controlled comparator.
And I'm going to ask Xavier this question as well. I'm just wondering, Xavier, is there any guidance provided from EMA about this situation where you have an uncontrolled trial and there's a look for historical control? I think ICHE 10 comes to mind, being a statistician, but there may be other guidance more recent.
We are, I don't know, guidance that exists already, but I know that we are developing guidance in the field of oncology, because this is a field where indeed there's a high need. And actually, I mentioned in my presentation the study that we have done and that we are analyzing on the use of real-world data in marketing authorization applications. We have examples where, at least one example that I have in mind, where the real-world evidence was the only evidence supporting the application, and it was successful. So it exists. In most of the case, real-world data are used as supporting evidence when there is a clinical trial, or a single-arm trial. But we have seen cases where the clinical trial were not convincing and enough, and use of real-world data were accepted as for conditional marketing authorization. So, but I would like to say that in most of the case, when this is accepted or not, I would say one of the main driver is probably the validity of the methodological aspect that were used, and this is standard epidemiological methods. And unfortunately, we often see that even standard epidemiological methods or statistical analysis were not appropriate. And this is a bit disappointing, actually, because indeed there are many people who have worked on registries and trying to collect data and so on. And then we see that the way the data are used are not really appropriate, because this is just a matter of, and I cited I have in mind now an example where this real-world evidence was accepted, but this was really based on a study that was done where there was such a good the quality control of the data collection, data analysis, that we as regulators, we really had the assurance. We thought that we have enough assurance about the validity of the data and of the analysis that was done. So what I would like to say, this is really this is really a matter of also, but not always, but it is also a matter of having the appropriate expertise and having the appropriate using the methods, using the standard. This is using the best standards and the best methodological standards, and this is not always the case, unfortunately.
And that's a really good point. So we've talked about the importance of the research question, the data quality, but then the methodology is really important. And I'm going to turn to Pia now, because we all are in awe of the Nordics and their rich data sources. And I always think Scotland is almost Nordic, really. But you have such good experience with real world data. Do the Nordic countries have good guidelines for how such data should be used? Does FinData produce those guidance? Could they be adapted for HTA? What's your thoughts on that?
I would say that FinData does not produce methodological guidance. That's one thing. FIMEA, we have some guidance for our HTA work that's old. We haven't updated because we see that like we can rely on international guidance, and we need to follow the same rules and standards as everyone else to make this joint work happen. FINOSE, which is the sort of HTA collaboration among FIMEA, TLV, and NOMA from Norway. We don't have guidance. We have workshops where we discuss these methodological issues and sometimes related to real world data. I think what I would like to point out that I think one of the issues is our processes, HTA processes, as I said previously. And one example came from a recent FINOSE collaboration where we assessed a new gene therapy for beta thalassemia, and that report has been published. And for the first time, we included a post-launch evidence generation section in our report, and it really, in my opinion, showed what's missing in our joint process, because this joint HTA led to a joint price negotiation also. But sort of in our Plex section in our report, we noted that, okay, in the market authorization, it was conditional on the company collecting data from product registry. And then we noted that, okay, the FINOSE mandate does not cover saying anything on outcome-based managed entry agreements. So we only noted that based on the cost effectiveness analysis, these are the uncertainties, the key uncertainties that exist in this analysis. And then the clinical community from the 3 countries said that perhaps we are not interested in joining the company data collection, but we want to enroll in this European clinical community register. So I think this shows we need to collaborate, we need to improve our processes, and we really need learning networks to do this together.
I think that's really important. And I'm going to sort of try and list some of the things I've heard where we need to collaborate more, not just HTA and payers with Xavier and EMA, but across networks, and see if we can tease that out a bit more. So I've heard very much that we need to collaborate beyond the joint assessment point into the collaboration of what is our core or minimum data set that we should be using for these kind of outcome-based managed entry agreements or reimbursement questions post HTA appraisal where we need further evidence. I've heard something about methodologies as well, about sharing methodologies for that, because we don't have HTA methodologies for this. Are there other things we should be collaborating on in this space? What can we do to actually move this forward? Any thoughts from anybody? Antje, do you want to start off with that?
Yes, maybe with great interest. I heard that Xavier said that also the EMA does not know when registries are useful or not useful. And sometimes maybe we should do some work on that where we had good experience and to identify or anticipate evidence gaps earlier to to identify the right candidate where it's really useful to invest all the money and the energy to put in to make maybe some registries. Another point is that we don't have a really good overview about registries. So even in Germany, we collect all kinds of data and have formulas for all kinds of things, but we don't have a good systematic database or research where we can find all registries and have maybe a quality control or self-quality control to select maybe systematically what might be the good platform to collect this data. And of course, methodology, everything else was so said, but to see that this not happened in Finland happened, that you just set up a new registry or a registry where no one would like to put their data in, and using rather European registry is actually a good example that doctors would like to put their data in the registry, which is already there. So I think maybe we need also a good registry of registries.
Yeah, I like that, a registry of registries. That will always help collaboration. And somebody here is also another good example would be sharing best practices of real world evidence. So not just sharing the good evidence sources that have been used in HTA, but actually trying to share some of the reappraisals where real world evidence has been used and has informed decisions. And I think there may be a question from Flora Giorgio. So I'm going to see if we can bring Flora in at this moment. I think we'll be able to open up her mic. Yes, I can see Flora on screen. Flora, you've been hearing lots here. Do you have any reflections on collaboration or the European health data space, all that exciting work that the Commission's getting involved in?
Thank you, Karen, for giving this possibility. And obviously, collaboration is for us a key word, considering that we have been supporting collaboration in this area, and we are still supporting collaboration not only in HTA but broader, also in the area of payers and obviously on the regulatory side, we have the agency. That's definitely the key word for us. And let me say a couple of things indeed in this respect. I think on the discussion were said today, I think one thing, just really to refer also what we have been supporting today, EUNETA also developed this quite interesting tool, this request tool that is really looking at how to support HTA bodies and as well technology developers in assessing the quality of the registry and how they could best meet their needs and what one and other were referring to, the methodological quality, the key element of the registry, and to see whether they are really fit for purpose to meet HTA needs. And I think that's an instrument, hopefully, that will be further developed, even though EUNETA in its current contract format will cease to exist. But I mean, hopefully that will be taken up by the HTA community. And then for tomorrow, obviously, well, it was said by Claudia, and I cannot avoid to refer to the HTA proposal, that it is now in hopefully what we see as being the last stage of the negotiation, which we believe could provide the framework where a lot of the topic you have been discussing today can be further addressed. Obviously, it will take time, as it will take time to actually address the methodological challenges that we have outlined in the discussion. So I think the proposal will provide this framework for the HTA bodies to really develop this type of guidelines and implementing this life cycle approach where post-launch evidence are so important together with, in all the phases. And last but not least, that was referred also by Xavier, for us, there is also this big agenda on European health data space where really can be the backbone to also support what is needed to have a better use of real world evidence and to have a better use in general of data for a different purpose. And the Commission plans a legislative proposal to set out the framework for this data space to enable better sharing of data that will address both the issue of sharing data for clinical purpose, but also, really how we can better use data for policy making and research, so the secondary use of data. And obviously there will be a number of points also to foster the single market, and we'll continue to support developing artificial intelligence, how this could actually help the sharing data. And what it was said by several, how we can make a best use of data. We have a lot of data, but we need the mean and we need the resource to analyze this data. And technology can do a lot, whether there is, let's say, the framework that enables this sharing. And I think in this context, Xavier has also referred to this, to the Darwin initiative, and there are a number of pilots ongoing, that are being assessed in the context of the European health data space that could really test a bit the feasibility of this approach by involving the data permit authority, HTA bodies, maybe regulators. I mean, it's a very large issue, so I will stop here, but I hope maybe there will be an opportunity, and then my colleagues from would be happy to also come back to this issue in a future event. So I'll leave it here for now.
Thank you very much for that, Flora. I feel like this is a conversation that's just starting, but it's a very important conversation, and I think we've identified a number of areas here. We've talked about the research questions, methodologies, the kind of repository where we can just start sharing things, and interesting things coming up in the questions about that kind of technical infrastructure, about how do we share data across countries. And I think that we're certainly looking to Darwin to help us resolve some of those issues, and the EU health data space. I think some of these we know are highly technical, legal, ethical issues that actually require the Commission to kind of take this forward. So we look forward to that. I've been trying to type up answers to some of the questions in the chat, and I apologize to those. I'll keep doing that while I hand over the floor to Yo. Yo's been very quietly listening to all of these reflections, and I'm going to ask him to sum up with some closing remarks.
Thanks a lot, Karen. I think this was an interesting meeting, an interesting webinar. We are all, I think, in favor to come on the beagle of data, the beagle which was a chip of Darwin, and I think we are now in a new period. We will experiencing, I think, in the coming years, exciting times. We have heard that for a long time, different member states have used already registries and so on, since 15 years in Italy even, but now we are coming in a transition, more in a transition in period, in a shift, which is of course aligned with the digital possibilities and opportunities we can deal with. I think what Xavier told us was that ambitious programs are underway, offering tools and possibilities to improve methodologies, to have and to lead to better decisions, both on the regulatory and on the HTA and payer body. I think this project, which will unlock a lot of data, map this data, the register of registries, as was mentioned. Of course, we should not overpromise all these things, as Rosine said very carefully. Let's be cautious, but let's be optimistic nevertheless. I think there are possibilities and opportunity to make progress. I'm very glad that Xavier made a clear invitation, a clear call for us payers, HTA bodies, to be associated with this Darwin program in order to clarify and indicate the evidence gaps which are existing from the side of payers and from the side of HTA bodies, to participate at the research questions which should be answered when medicinal products come on the market and are reimbursed, but also to plan the right collection of data. It's not a question of data, it's a question of the good research questions which allow us to make the right decisions. And as I said, member states have used this real-world data, but this was not real-world data. They had another name. It was registries, but nevertheless, these registries seem to be the most common source of real-world data for the moment. But nevertheless, it's a clear understanding that we can improve the quality of this data and also the procedures in which they used and settled. There are some quality issues, and it was clearly said this directive or this guidance of registry quality is an important tool, and it was also a call to say, okay, let's do the same thing for electronic health records. Don't overestimate, of course, what can be done with all these registries, but it's of course the need to find a good balance which is not shifting the burden of proof to the payers only, but it should be a real collaboration in which everybody and every partner, every stakeholder takes part and takes the risks. Participation is key, and I think that's an important one. We see that a lot of countries are already collecting data with the clinical community as a condition for reimbursement and for access to medication. I think that is a very important evolution. What we are trying to do, of course, is improve our decisions, but also to have more information about the outcomes, and therefore we should do it on a prospective way. We have also heard that, of course, there are feasibility problems. It's not cheap. In the chat there were questions about funding and so on. It should be clarified in which way we can make progress. And of course, the buzzword which is coming back, it's not a buzzword, it's the need to collaborate between stakeholders, between member states, exchange, as was said in the chat, across borders. And of course, we should try to find together also the right answers to the questions we are confronted with. Transparency was also mentioned as an important element. And the last word, and we are very honored also not only to have Xavier Kurtz and all the panelists with us, but also the European Commission, is we wish good luck to Flora, but all to others member states for the HTA directive, which is underway. And I think we can find a place to integrate this real-world data approach in this HTA agenda and in the other agenda which are underway. I think that are some conclusions, not conclusions, but some elements I've noticed during the discussion and during the keynote speech of Xavier. Thanks again. Thanks to all panelists, thanks to the audience, thanks especially to Karen, also to IT managers, also to the Secretariat of Real World for decisions. I think it was a good webinar, and it's we are look forward for the second one, which will take place, I think, in the month of September. Thank you all, and have a nice evening and a nice day. Thanks.
And I would just say that Real World Evidence for Decisions would love to keep in contact, and in the chat box you'll see links to social media and to our website. And if you just sign up to those, you'll see the date of the upcoming webinars and our future activities. And we love to hear what's going on because we're a learning network. So if you've got things you want to share with the network, just pop them into the Secretariat and they'd be pleased to put them in the next newsletter. So I'd just like to add my thanks to Joe, because it's an army that leads all of this work. So thank you, Joe, for all of this. And I'm aware that we haven't answered all of Xavier's questions, but we'll come back. And I think the basic answer, Xavier, is HTA payers want to collaborate in everything. They want to ask questions into that coordinated center. They want to be involved in the training and to learn from all of your methodologies, and to be involved in scientific advice to make sure that we're thinking about payer needs when we start talking about real world evidence. So more collaboration. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Bye.